Fertility rates are dropping worldwide. Birth rates are below replacement in nearly every developed country. This has sparked a fierce debate. What should women be doing with their lives? Is it staying home, not working, raising a family, work just being a corporate distraction? Or are the kids the distraction? Take away that of a woman's true desire, which is the freedom to pursue whatever career they want, travel, and so on. Hi, I'm Natasha, currently a stay-at-home mom who grew up dreaming about my career. I decided to dive into this issue, and what I found is that both of these sides are telling the truth. To figure out our true nature, I believe we first have to look in the historical time period we spent the most amount of our development in. Since the time we were defined as Homo sapiens, we had an incredibly large period of time where we were defined as hunter-gatherers, and that lasted roughly 288,000 years. What were the roles of men and women then? It was often thought that men were the hunters and women were the gatherers. And that's kind of true, but I think a better category separation would be the birthers and the non-birthers. If you think of men and women as totally exactly the same, and then you give one of them the task of making a baby, large differences start emerging. Before pregnancy, you get your period, you will have miscarriages. If your baby lasts, you're looking at 9 months of pregnancy where you are weak, you're sick, there's a giant ball attached to you, and then birth. We all know birth is deadly and insane. There's breastfeeding, which before I had a baby, I didn't know how labor intensive it was. Back in those times, people breastfed their babies for 3 to 4 years. That's an incredible amount of drain on you. And you're also going to be generally the one carrying the babies because they will breastfeed while you carry them. All this to say, it's a very labor intensive process. And in that time, 1 in 4 babies didn't even make it past the age of 1. This is literally the most important job you could do. There's no tribe without new tribe members. It naturally, from that perspective, wouldn't make sense for you to try to push yourself to do physical activity or push yourself to do dangerous jobs. Just need to focus on that as the main task for the survival of the tribe. Because of this biological reality, men were doing more physical jobs. Men did more just general conflict jobs. Women worked lots within the tribe. They were carrying their babies to go get food, to cook, to tell stories, to heal, to take care of others' children. These roles all would not be the same as the equivalent of a stay-at-home mom. These are more equivalent to the working roles that females are generally drawn to today, such as being a teacher, a nurse, a psychologist, a writer, a social media marketer. Main difference between then and today is that all this work is very compatible with caring for your baby. So you could heal somebody and then have to go feed your baby and then heal the next person. And I want to get this clear. The roles were based mostly on practicality and need. Studies are showing now that lots of women hunted. And I think, well, yeah, duh. Probably lots of men were gathering too. There wasn't a rule book about what men could do and what women could do. You just have to think of it of like what made sense on a needs-based and skill-based framework. They were just trying to survive the jungle, you know? And kids were generally raised not just by the mom, but the whole tribe. If the guy you chose to procreate with suddenly was a bad guy, he had little power over you. You still have shelter, you still have food. You're providing your own value and stake in the tribe. But what happened when people stopped being nomadic? When cities were created and laws were put in place that did put a legal difference between men and women. The agricultural revolution. It's so stupid. So core theme of this video is that innovation is fabulous and great and provides a lot of benefits, but it does come with trade-offs. People realize kind of across the world, you could plant seeds and then you wouldn't have to forage for food and then move your tribe around all the time. That was 12,000 years ago, led to way less food insecurity. However, unfortunately, now you have the responsibility to grow those crops and protect your land, and you were vulnerable to droughts, diseases, this kind of thing. Since men had been the ones to develop their strength and their weapons knowledge, they were the ones able to protect their property. And so the invention of property rights came about. And because it was something that males could protect, property was passed down through males. This suddenly put a lot of legal restrictions on women because suddenly it was very important that your son was actually your son and not your neighbor's son. That your sexuality and freedom of movement was more confined and controlled. Okay, so then that's when women became housewives. Well, no. The farm was a collective project from the family. So women would work alongside their families together. Babies suddenly got a lot easier to have closer together and care for because of grain that babies could eat. A woman could stop breastfeeding way earlier. A woman didn't have to carry her baby all around the place. Family was working together. So each kid a woman had was an economic asset. Every child she had made her more free and more prosperous. Women ran was now known as the cottage industry. Women were dominating the textile, brewing, preserving, baking, cheese, candle making industries, and so on. They'd run these businesses from their home. They were working in similar ways they had been working before, where they would spin some cloth, they'd feed their babies, and then they'd get back to it. People often came directly to their houses to buy things. To imply that women were housewives in the same way that we understand it today, wherein they're just baking from scratch for their own husband and family, is just not true at all. They were hustling. If hunter-gatherers weren't housewives, and in the agricultural times they weren't housewives either, where did we get this housewife impression? Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Again, with progress comes costs. Factories blew up all over the world. These factories changed what we defined as work. Let's look at how this affected men and women. For men, they were off the farm and into someone else's factory. They were working 12 to 16-hour shifts, had long commutes, and it was 6 days a week. That's a lot of time suddenly away from their families and previous community. For women, the cottage industry we talked about was wiped out. All the things women thrived at making, a company could do for way better, way faster, and way cheaper. There was nothing left for them to sell and provide value, and the type of work that the factory was offering was obviously in no way compatible to having children. No longer could you work, feed your baby, and then keep working. You'd have to go off and be separated from your child or lose money while you didn't work at all. Here's the thing, lots of women were still working. Lots had to outsource their childcare to family members and friends. Lots found unconventional work, but of course it was difficult, and most of that would be about providing financially. So cultural understandings had to start changing. It became deemed appropriate for a man to earn a family's salary, meaning that one salary should be able to cover the entire cost of his family. It would allow his wife to raise children without having to leave them with a stranger or forego having them at all. It went from the family, mom, dad, and kids all working together on the farm, to the father being the one that had to economically provide for everyone. Children stopped being assets and they turned into liabilities. Now they are costs. They don't work. Factories are dangerous places. It wouldn't be appropriate to send your child to a factory. So now, with each child a woman had, she'd lose wealth and therefore lose freedom. Men and women became separate entities, not building their lives together, and women lost their value to society. We know that oftentimes housewives felt miserable and isolated, and men also felt miserable and isolated. They were away from their families all day. Their community was working in a factory for 16 hours. And to deal with the societal pain that progress had created, there was a lie that was formed, that women's only desire was to stay home and raise children. That was her role, the domestic sphere. And men should not really be interested in that sphere. The way that they should show love was to go out and work and bring more economic value. If you were unhappy, it wasn't something wrong with the system, it was something wrong with you. But get this, even with this cultural understanding, a lot of women were still working. Being a stay-at-home wife was reserved for the middle class. Poor women were still working, and rich women were still working. Obviously, the poor women usually were doing it for economic reasons, and the rich women were working more self-actualizing jobs. In the peak of the housewife era that we all reference to, the 1950s, there was an influx of housewives because of the economic boom. The poorer families, where the wives were working, suddenly had the financial opportunities to stay home instead. In that time, it was reported 73% of women were stay-at-home moms. A lot, but once again, there was still 30-ish% of women still working, and that's documented work. So any work that was happening under the table or any self-businesses wouldn't have been counted in those statistics. And this housewife boom didn't even last like 20 years. So all of our history to 20 years is not really really that significant. All this to say that generally, historically, women be working. Women have been working kind of the whole time. In fact, the first mission of feminism was rights for women who were already working. The legality at the time was that if a woman was single or widowed, she was her own person and any money she made legally belonged to her. But if she was married, everything legally belonged to her husband. Lots of women would work, earn a paycheck, and then their husbands would take it from them and spend it themselves. If a woman tried to leave her husband, it was more than just socially frowned upon and legally difficult. She basically had nothing to fight with. The feminist movement worked really well, was explosive, spitballed into women gaining a ton of rights. Good job. Unfortunately though, there was another human development coming, about to unfortunately rain on their parade. Before we get into those new human developments, let's go over some factors that made being a boomer parent a bit more difficult than the time before it. Feminism gave rights to women, but didn't change the cultural narrative for men's roles. Still, a father was supposed to provide economically for his contribution to the family. To do laundry, clean diapers was still seen as him being more feminine and therefore actually being less good at providing. This was heavily perpetuated by women themselves, by the way. If a man saw his wife struggling, he was supposed to take on more shifts, ask for a raise, maybe to hire help from other women to do those domestic tasks. So women entered the workforce, but they still had to do all the domestic stuff, working 40 hours a week and then coming home with still the expectations of cleanliness and childcare duties left over from the past. And unfortunately, the economy was not in an economic boom anymore because of the increased spending on the Vietnam and Cold War. Inflation was spiking, making everything less affordable. And because Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard in 1971, this inflation was never going to self-correct again. But that's for another video. For now, just know that no, women entering the workforce was not the cause of indefinite inflation and the sudden inability for families to exist on just one income alone. But back to the storyline. Women were burning out completely. Men were still upset. The economy was far from where it was in their parents' generation. And then the boomers were hit with the most massive human advancement yet. The tech revolution. Before you comment, there's a bunch of different sociological opinions on this, and many suggest the tech revolution is just a part of the industrial revolution, and there's various perceived starting points. But to me, doing my research on this, the starting point for the context, especially of men and women's roles, is clearly June 1st, 1980. This is the date that CNN, cable news network, started airing its 24-hour news cycle. News went from 30 minutes at the end of the day to 24-hour coverage. News covered many stories it wouldn't have before. It was news of child kidnappings, accidents, general not good, scary news. This was the change that turned the culture from letting your kids play outside somewhere till the sun went down to you should be monitoring your child constantly. This was not good for the already double shift working mom. TV became a constant, always-on presence. Talk shows exploded. Lots of parenting experts were constantly coming on and giving advice. Parenting shifted into a more intensive, all-consuming project. Remember when children were working on the farm next to us? Remember when we lived in these communal societies and people were sharing the childcare responsibility? Now even chore responsibilities dropped significantly. The narrative being you should try and give your kids this responsibility-free, magical childhood full of toys and experiences, which, by the way, the TV was also advertising 24/7. Kids were let to watch TV a lot to give the exhausted parents a break. People got addicted to the television. Millennials, that's me, saw their parents burn out and oftentimes be miserable. The economy kept getting worse and tech just kept advancing. And so I think it's not too crazy to see what happened next.
I mean, what if I don't want to live the way you live?
Oh, don't be ridiculous, Andrea. Everybody wants this.
Dramatic. Now listen, biologically speaking, people are different. But still, there's some generalities that a lot of people fall into. That's why they're called generalities. I'm absolutely not saying that all people have the innate desire to have children. Some do not. What I am saying is that the amount of people choosing child-free today, that looks like something different than just exposing natural desires to be child-free now that we have rights and birth control. Millennials and Gen X's first impression of the world was of a dysregulated and burnt out home life. And then they look further back, their grandmother's time, with lots of grandmothers reporting feeling trapped at the role of the housewife. No career didn't work. Trying to have it all, both career and kids, didn't work. It feels like the natural progression to go the other way. Work is still away from the home and on someone else's schedule. You should get a career that is fancy, high paying, have it be settled before having children, so that you might be rich enough to afford daycare, hired help, and afford to not be economically tied into your marriage, unable to leave. People delayed having children because they had to get all that stuff set up first. People are just not even ready to have children until way later. And by the time they're in their 30s, they've already created a identity of themselves that is child-free. The progress in tech continued to blossom, providing tons of benefits, but also lots of negative side effects. We have massive leaps in mental health disorders, in loneliness. We have endless comparison and the perception of endless opportunity, being overwhelmed by the amount of life choices that you have. And apps like Tinder turned courtship into gambling. Women and men are struggling to even form lasting long-term relationships, let alone thinking about starting families. You wouldn't have that same thing if we were all in a tribe. You'd have like 4 people to choose from. In terms of the domestic sphere, men actually did enter the home in big ways. Studies show that despite still skewed to men providing more financially, it's now culturally expected a man contributes domestically. Unfortunately though, this obviously hasn't helped the birth rate because the workload is still too much. Working full-time and coming home and doing full-time parenting, which the parental expectations have exploded even further for, cause both men and women to still decide against having kids. And these trends aren't helping.
Just don't have kids.
Not to brag, but what a time to be childless.
Falling in love and making a family is an inherent human desire. Once again, I'm speaking in generalities. It's a known hormonal phenomenon that both men and women experience baby fever. And culturally, I mean all of our music, all of our films, our poems, they're not a bunch of lies. Our stories about connection and family, even strong friendships, show how much we deeply care about one another. Having a life partner that you build your life with and creating new family members that you give the gift of being alive to is a beautiful, wonderful human experience. But at the moment, there's a lot of factors that compete with this beauty, that make it stressful, that make you feel like you have to sacrifice too much to get it. And when you don't have your needs met, when you're constantly stressed, you get resentful. If it feels impossible to have kids successfully, it's easier to create the cultural lie that children and family are awful, that people don't really want them anyway. And do not get me wrong, having kids is hard, especially in our societal setup. But some things in these videos are obviously exaggerations. Some of it is emotional bait. But this trend is obviously adding to the low fertility rates. How could it not? If your friends aren't having kids and you're doing this alone, it's further isolating. So with that all being said, what can we do? How can we have some of the societal structure that we had in the past? In terms of community, I'm not really sure. Our societies and culture are not really set up for communal living at all anymore. It's awkward now to even ask your neighbor over for dinner. In terms of work compatibility with raising children, my biggest idea would be the continuation of the tech industry. Working from home became normalized in 2020. That's a great way to feed your baby and get back to work as long as it's on a flexible schedule. And AI, sore subject, terrifying, but it's also potentially empowering a lot of people to start their own businesses, be their own boss, learn skills that they would have never even attempted before or would have to have gone to school for before, they can now do from home. We could see a resurgence of the cottage industry with women owning their own online businesses. It's kind of already happening. 25% of mothers in the US work from home, at least some of the time, and 49% of all new businesses registered in the USA are from women, and 1 in 3 of those are moms. Of course, we're killing it. We've been working the whole time. This is in us. In conclusion, when we have a debate topic like should women work or be a traditional stay-at-home wife, I would love it if we were discussing it in real terms. Women have always been working. They like to work. It's a good thing for women to work. The bigger issue is the nature of our current work and how it's incompatible. It's at odds with the family, which is very important for happiness as well. How can we make working and having a family and social life and leisure time compatible again? That's the big question. See you in the next one.